In the slow rhythm of centuries, before the hum of machines and the white roar of modern printing, there existed a quieter economy, one measured not in gold, but in texture. It was the faint crackle of a page, the soft drag of quill across a grain, the near-silent sigh of fibers giving way beneath ink. In the age of kings and chroniclers, before the world learned to shout its history, it was paper that whispered the truth. And among all the crowns and courts of Europe, none were more particular, more ceremoniously obsessed, than the Portuguese royal household. The Royal Court of Lisbon, perched between the restless Atlantic and the brittle cliffs of empire, was a world sustained by paper. Paper for the ledgers of merchants, paper for the decrees of monarchs, paper for the meticulous registers of ships bound for Goa and Brazil. It was a material that appeared delicate, yet under its pale surface pulsed the entire machinery of empire. And behind its elegance, there lay a labyrinth, an unending chain of craftsmen, carters, scribes, and secretaries, each bound to the invisible task of keeping the royal flow of paper uninterrupted. Those who served this unseen network often thought of their work as a ritual. The making and moving of paper was not merely a craft, it was an act of devotion. For the Portuguese believed that paper bore spirit, that the very sheets upon which edicts were inscribed retained traces of human intention. It absorbed ink as the soul absorbed memory. Thus, every sheet destined for royal hands had to be pure. It had to be perfect. It had to pass through the alchemical scrutiny of those entrusted with its journey from pulp to parchment, from mill to palace. The story of this logistical manual, a document both real and imagined, begins in the late 17th century, when the royal bureaucracy of Portugal reached its most intricate form. The court at Ribeira Palace swelled with clerks, accountants, naval recorders, and noble secretaries, each tasked with translating empire into record. The discoveries of centuries past had matured into commerce, and commerce demanded documentation. The Portuguese Empire spanned oceans, yet its coherence existed only in paper: invoices from Luanda, reports from Macau, inventories from Salvador de Bahia. Each arrived sealed, each consumed new pages upon their return. In a world before paper mills turned endlessly, the supply of such material was precarious. The crown's demand was constant, yet its sources were fragile, dependent on forests that withered, mills that faltered, rivers that dried, and caravels that sank. It was, in every sense, a system that lived on the edge of disappearance. The manual itself, known to historians only through fragments, was said to have been compiled under the supervision of a royal quartermaster named Dom Afonso de Vale, a man of meticulous silence. Little survives of him beyond a few marginal notes, but from those, a portrait emerges, a servant of logistics, devoted not to glory but to the quiet precision of supply. He saw in the movement of paper something sacred, a choreography that connected the raw to the refined, the earthly to the divine. Dom Afonso's instructions were written in a style both bureaucratic and poetic, as if he understood that in the folds of procedure lay the architecture of power. He divided his manual into sections, of mills and water, of carriage and salt air, of counting and custody, and of royal consumption. Each chapter blended calculation with reflection, suggesting that even in the realm of inventory, mystery endured. "Let no shipment be sent unblessed," he wrote in one passage, "for the ocean does not bear unmarked goods. Ink must precede wind." This was not a metaphor. To ship paper to Lisbon, one had to seal the bales with wax marked by royal insignia, a ritual to prevent theft, but also to invite providence. Sailors whispered prayers over them, believing that paper, unlike other cargo, attracted spirits of memory. It was said that the smell of ink could calm tempests or awaken them, depending on whether the paper carried truth or deceit. Each sheet's journey began in silence. Up in the narrow valleys of the Serra da Estrela, where icy rivers wound through mills, rag-gatherers trudged along mountain paths. They carried sacks of linen remnants, torn shirts, worn robes, discarded handkerchiefs. In those rags lay the ghosts of the people, peasants, monks, widows, children, whose daily lives would, through water and pulp, be transformed into vessels for royal decree. At the mills, these remnants were soaked and beaten, turned into a pale suspension that moved like milk under the wooden hammers of the pilos. The air was cold and moist, scented faintly with decay. Workers spoke little. They had learned to listen, to the rhythm of the hammers, to the creak of the wheels, to the whisper of fibers dissolving. To them, this was a craft both physical and metaphysical. The royal inspectors visited rarely, but when they did, their presence changed everything. They carried with them sealed orders, cartas do selo real, commanding the production of a specific number of reams, each to be watermarked with the royal arms. No other customer could interfere. The mills became temples of silence. Every sheet destined for the court was handled with gloves, every watermark examined by candlelight. And yet, it was not perfection that mattered most, it was purity. A single stain could ruin a batch, for the court demanded that its records appear untouched by labor. From the mountains, the paper began its descent toward the sea. Packed into crates lined with linen, it traveled by mule to Coimbra, where clerks checked the seal of each mill. Then, onward to Lisbon, a journey of days, sometimes weeks, across rugged terrain. The carters stopped at convents for lodging, where monks would sometimes use the opportunity to trade a few sheets for ink or candles. These illicit exchanges were part of the quiet economy that surrounded royal paper, the invisible commerce of fragments. When the crates reached Lisbon, they were stored in the Armazém de Papel do Reino, the royal warehouse for all written materials. There, among the scent of glue and mold, the real work began. For paper was only as useful as its record, and so every ream had to be logged, every shipment signed by the Escrivão do Papel. Ink met paper to account for paper, a recursion that the clerks joked about in low voices. The warehouse became a world of lists, lists of sheets, lists of deliveries, lists of lists. The act of counting itself seemed infinite. From the warehouse, distribution followed the needs of the crown. Some sheets went to the royal chancellery, where scribes drafted laws that would govern faraway colonies. Others went to the court's library, where chroniclers copied ancient texts by candlelight. Still others went to the royal chapel, where calligraphers illuminated prayers. In every corner of the palace, the same fragile sound could be heard, the soft rasp of pen against paper, the murmur of ink drying. But paper, once consumed, did not simply vanish. The discarded fragments, drafts, rejected petitions, spoiled pages, were gathered and burned. The ashes were mixed with wax to seal new shipments. In this cycle, destruction fed creation. Dom Afonso's manual recorded it plainly: let the remnants of decree serve again, for no royal word is ever lost. To the modern ear, such logistics may sound mundane. But in the hush of the Portuguese court, where power expressed itself through silence, the paper trade was a heartbeat. Behind each royal edict lay an invisible chain of labor and devotion, the forgotten mills, the mule paths, the shadowed warehouses. The act of supplying paper was, in its way, a ceremony of continuity. And so, this manual, this imagined compendium of rules, receipts, and rituals, stands as both a document of function and a meditation on fragility. It reminds us that empires, like sheets of paper, are only as strong as the fibers that bind them. The Portuguese understood this deeply. Perhaps too deeply. For among the surviving fragments of Dom Afonso's writings, there is one passage that has troubled historians. It reads, "When the ink begins to vanish before it dries, know that the court no longer exists." No one knows precisely what he meant. Some think it was a metaphor for corruption, others, a premonition of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, when fire consumed the archives and the sea reclaimed the coast. But perhaps it was something else, a recognition that the logistics of empire were always more ephemeral than they appeared. As the centuries turned and machines replaced mills, the royal warehouses emptied. Yet the scent of old paper lingers in Lisbon still, faint, sweet, and mournful. In the quiet hours before dawn, archivists claim they sometimes hear the soft rustle of unseen pages turning. Perhaps the manuals are being read again, by those who never slept. This is where our descent begins, into the anatomy of a vanished bureaucracy, the slow pulse of parchment and decree, the sacred mechanics of supply. To understand how the Portuguese court received its paper is to glimpse the ghostly infrastructure of history itself, a system both precise and unknowable, practical yet haunted by intention. Let us now enter the first chapter of the manual. The ink has been mixed, the ledgers opened. The mills stir. The mules wait. And somewhere in the distance, the ocean murmurs, awaiting its cargo of paper and prayer. Before the ink, there was water. The manual begins, as all things in Portugal once began, with the river, that long silver thread binding the living and the lost. It was not the ocean, but the smaller, inland streams that first gave the kingdom its pages. The royal court, seated at the edge of the Atlantic, depended entirely upon the rhythmic pulse of rivers far from its marble chambers. Without their cold persistence, no decree could ever have been written, no law sealed, no voyage recorded. The Livro de Abastecimento do Papel Real, the supply manual that guided this vast and delicate system, opened with an instruction of peculiar calm. Attend first to the current, for it is the hand that writes before the pen. To the men and women who tended the paper mills scattered across the northern provinces, particularly around Leiria, Tomar, and Covilhã, these words were more than technical. They were prayer. Water was their god of motion, the keeper of rhythm, the arbiter of texture. Each mill was constructed not beside the river, but almost within it, its walls darkened by spray, its timbers perpetually damp. The wheels turned endlessly, clattering and sighing, feeding their force into the great wooden hammers that pounded rags into pulp. Dom Afonso de Vale's manual described in quiet precision how such mills were to be arranged. The foundation had to rest on stone, the wheel must face east, to greet the first light of morning, and the hammers, he wrote, should never fall without song. It is believed that the phrase referred to the workers' chants, a low, almost monotonous rhythm used to time the strokes. But there are those who interpret it differently, that the mill itself, through its steady drumming, was a form of prayer. The work began before dawn. The rag-gatherers, pale from months of cold, arrived with their bundles bound in twine. Each sack was inspected in silence. Only linen was permitted, wool and silk were forbidden, for they yielded coarse or slippery pulp. Women worked the sorting benches, cutting away seams, removing buttons, folding the cloth into even stacks. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and age. From the open door of the mill, a line of mist drifted across the river, veiling the water in shades of pearl and smoke. The next step, soaking, required patience. The rags were submerged in wide stone vats filled with river water and lime, where they would ferment for days. The manual warned against haste, let the cloth surrender of its own will. Workers knew the sound of readiness, the faint hiss when the rags broke apart under touch. They lifted them gently, as one might lift fragile leaves, and carried them to the beating troughs. There, under the hammers, the transformation began. The great wooden pistons, driven by the water wheel, rose and fell with slow authority. Each impact sent droplets into the air, which glittered in the dim light like dust from a dream. The rags dissolved, fiber by fiber, into a soft, pale slurry. This was the birth of paper, the point at which matter forgot its shape and became possibility. To the royal quartermasters, this process was chemistry. To the millers, it was alchemy. They spoke of the pulp as a living thing, of the water as its breath, of the wooden hammers as its heartbeat. And somewhere, within that rhythmic drumming, a strange comfort emerged, a sense that their labor connected them to something vast, unseen, and enduring. When the pulp reached the proper texture, thick as cream, yet smooth as cloud, it was poured into the vats. From here, the papermakers took over, their hands practiced, slow, and exact. Each held a rectangular mold framed in wood and lined with fine wire mesh. Dipping it into the vat, they lifted it out again with an even motion, letting the pulp settle into a thin, trembling film. The excess water drained away, and the sheet took form, soft, luminous, barely there. The moment the mold tilted, the fibers aligned, giving the paper its hidden grain. The manual recorded the precise angle, 15 degrees from the horizon, as if to remind future craftsmen that even perfection required obedience to geometry. The newly formed sheets were transferred onto felt, one atop another, alternating in rhythm. When the stack grew tall, it was pressed under heavy wooden beams, squeezing out the last of the river. The sound of the press was low and patient, like the closing of doors in a faraway hall. And always, water returned, flowing beneath the floorboards, murmuring through the sluice gates, whispering against the wheel. The mills were built not merely upon the river, but within its voice. Outside, the forests that fed the mills stood dark and perpetual. Poplar and willow supplied the rods for pressing, chestnut gave the smoke for drying rooms. The Portuguese climate, mild yet damp, demanded constant vigilance. A day too warm, and the sheets would warp, a night too cold, and they would freeze. The manual prescribed the use of river wind, that is, air channeled through openings cut precisely to catch the current, as the ideal method of drying. Artificial heat, it warned, awakens the ghosts of the rags. To a modern mind, such warnings seem quaint, yet they reveal a quiet metaphysics underlying the craft. Every sheet of royal paper was thought to contain the residue of its origins, the breath of the worker, the purity of the water, the patience of its pressing. If the process were rushed or the air impure, the sheet might carry within it an unseen defect, a weakness that, once written upon, could cause the ink to blur or the page to crumble. By mid-morning, the mills filled with a faint, steady light. Dust motes drifted in the air like suspended ash. The workers, men with rough hands, women with sleeves rolled high, moved in silence. To speak was to break the rhythm. Even the children who carried the felt layers between presses were trained to step softly. They were told that the fibers could hear. At intervals, inspectors from the Casa do Papel Real arrived to measure the thickness of the sheets. They carried calipers carved from ivory and dipped each sample in water to test its resilience. Those that passed were set aside for watermarking. The rest were discarded or sold cheaply to merchants. It was an act of quiet hierarchy, the division between the paper of power and the paper of the common world. Watermarking was performed by candlelight. Thin metal wires, bent into the shapes of crowns, crosses, and armillary spheres, were sewn onto the mesh of the mold. When pulp settled upon it, the mark became part of the paper's being, an image visible only when held to light. The manual devoted an entire section to these emblems, noting their variations and proportions. The royal mark, it stated, must sit neither proud nor faint, but as a shadow within substance. To produce a single ream, 500 sheets, required days of labor and thousands of strikes of the hammer. Yet the mills worked tirelessly. For every decree, every inventory, every maritime log, demanded new paper. In Lisbon, the clerks of the royal chancellery recorded the arrival of each shipment with reverence, 500 leaves for His Majesty's word, delivered by the river Mondego. The supply line stretched wide. Carters, muleteers, and bargemen formed the living arteries of the system. They knew the value of their cargo, light as breath, yet worth more than salt. To lose a crate of royal paper was to invite suspicion of theft, or worse, treason. The manual prescribed that each shipment be sealed with wax and marked by number and date. Let no mule carry its burden unnumbered, it warned. Paper lost is memory lost. At night, when the mills slept, the sound of the river deepened. The workers lay in their wooden huts, listening to the endless water. Some claimed they could hear whispers in its flow, faint words, syllables not quite human. The priests who blessed the mills each spring said it was only the echo of labor, but the millers were not convinced. They believed the river remembered everything that passed through it, the rags, the prayers, the sweat, the silence. The manual made no mention of superstition. Its pages were disciplined, orderly, filled with diagrams and inventories. Yet beneath the language of logistics lay a quiet awareness of mystery. In one marginal note, now half erased, Dom Afonso wrote, "The purity of paper depends not only upon water, but upon time. Haste corrupts fiber as deceit corrupts soul." He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the supply of paper to a royal court was not merely an act of material provision, but of moral continuity. The sheets bore witness. On them, ministers recorded the laws that would govern entire colonies, chroniclers described the movements of stars, confessors wrote the sins of princes. If the paper itself were tainted, if it carried within it impurity, what then of the words it bore? Thus, every stage of its creation became a ceremony of precision. The millers worked as though under oath, their labor woven into the invisible fabric of empire. They did not see the royal court, nor the ships that carried Portuguese power across oceans. But they felt its breath in every order that reached them, stamped with wax, carried by a rider, unfolding like a commandment. And so, from water and rag, from rhythm and silence, the kingdom's memory was born. At the end of each season, when the last of the winter batches had dried, the mills were scrubbed clean. The troughs were drained, the wheels stilled. Workers gathered at dusk, lighting small candles along the riverbank. Some said it was to honor the Virgin, others, to appease the river's hunger. The flames trembled upon the dark surface, their reflections scattering like stars across a forgotten sky. In that moment, the mills ceased to be factories and became altars, places where labor met devotion, where the humble act of papermaking became a ritual of continuity. The next morning, they would begin again. For the royal court of Portugal waited, always, for paper. And the mills, bound by duty and water, could never truly rest. By the time the sun reached its noonday height, the river valleys had settled into a deep, resonant quiet. The mills continued their ceaseless rhythm, but the world beyond them, the woods, the mountain passes, the narrow trails where mule hooves struck stone, existed in a stillness that felt almost deliberate. Within this silence, an invisible order persisted, one that linked every movement of water and fiber to the distant geometry of the royal seal. Dom Afonso de Vale, whose manual defined the standards for the entire operation, treated the question of purity as a theological one. The section titled Of the Custody of Paper began with an invocation. Let no hand unwashed touch the sheet, for paper is the kingdom's breath made visible. In that sentence lay the philosophy of the entire enterprise. The papermakers were not merely laborers, they were custodians of spirit. They carried within their roughened fingers the promise of coherence, the assurance that every royal word would be legible, every decree preserved, every act of empire recorded without blemish. Each morning began with ritual cleansing. Before touching the pulp, workers dipped their hands in the same river that powered the mill. The chill of the water bit into their skin, yet they did not flinch. The manual prescribed that washing be done in silence, lest the waters grow weary of hearing complaint. Only after this quiet ablution could they approach the vats. In the faint mist rising from the surface, they sometimes imagined the shape of letters, strange premonitions of the words that the court would one day write. When the pulp had been formed into sheets and pressed between felt, a more delicate phase began, drying and finishing. The manual demanded precision to the hour. Paper left damp too long, it warned, will carry the scent of decay, and that scent will breed corruption in record. And yet, drying too quickly was no less dangerous. A balance had to be struck, between air and moisture, between movement and stillness. The drying lofts were narrow chambers of wood, open to the river wind. Inside, lines were strung in perfect parallel, and upon them, hundreds of sheets hung like pale apparitions. From a distance, they resembled rows of ghosts, swaying gently in the light. The workers passed between them with reverent care, turning each sheet so that both sides met the air evenly. To walk through such a loft was to enter a corridor of silence, the faint flutter of paper the only sound, the scent of wet fiber sweet and faintly sorrowful. Dom Afonso's manual instructed that every 10th sheet be held to the light. Observe the passage of the sun through the grain, he wrote. If the fibers form a web too tight, the sheet will reject ink, if too loose, it will swallow it. There was no machinery to test such things, only the trained eye, the practiced sense of how light behaved when passing through matter. Those who could read this radiance were said to have the sight, a gift that no apprenticeship could teach. When the drying was complete, the paper was stacked and pressed once more, then polished with smooth stones until its surface gleamed faintly like bone. Each ream was wrapped in linen, tied with cord, and sealed with wax stamped with the mark of the mill. The manual insisted that this sealing be performed at twilight, when light bends, but before darkness claims it. Scholars still debate whether this had practical purpose or symbolic meaning. Perhaps it was both. For in the half-light, the paper appeared most alive, shimmering faintly as though remembering the water from which it came. In the villages surrounding the mills, the presence of royal paper carried both pride and unease. To handle such material was to be near power, but also near danger. Stories spread of those who had stolen scraps and fallen ill, or whose houses had caught fire without cause. The superstitious whispered that royal paper was not meant for common ink, that the spirits bound to its fibers would take offense. The priests denied such tales, yet even they were careful when writing sermons on royal stock. The ink bled differently, they said, darker, slower, as though the paper were listening. The supply chain that connected these remote valleys to Lisbon relied upon precision bordering on obsession. Carters were chosen not for strength, but for temperament. They had to be patient, cautious, and capable of silence. The manual declared, "A man too eager to reach the city will lose more than time. Let the pace of the mule match the breadth of the mountain." Each cart bore the royal insignia burned into its side, a sun, a wave, and a crown. Within, the bales were cushioned with straw and covered with oilcloth to protect against rain. The routes followed the old Roman roads, crumbling and treacherous, winding through villages where curious eyes lingered. Yet few dared approach. For in the realm of superstition, the cargo was considered holy, and to interfere with it was to risk misfortune that would cling for generations. Along the journey, the carters maintained meticulous records. Every bridge crossed, every night spent, every drop of water consumed by their beasts was written in small leather-bound ledgers. These journals were later inspected by the Escrivao do Papal, the royal scribe of supplies, who compared them to the master inventory in Lisbon. Any discrepancy, even of a single ream, demanded investigation. Paper, after all, was not merely material but symbol. A missing sheet was a missing truth. When the carts reached the city, they entered through the western gate, where the Guarda Real do Papal awaited. These guards, dressed not in armor but in black wool robes, were tasked with protecting the sanctity of the shipment. They carried no swords, only ledgers. Their power lay in documentation. They opened the bales, inspected the seals, noted the scent, the watermark, the cut. Each inspection was an act of devotion, a bureaucratic liturgy conducted beneath the scent of ink and river mold. Only after passing inspection would the paper be carried to the Armazém de Papel do Reino, the royal warehouse by the harbor, where moisture hung heavy and the walls bore centuries of ink stains. Inside, light filtered through narrow slits, illuminating floating dust that looked like the residue of memory itself. The clerks moved through this haze with deliberate slowness, their footsteps muffled by layers of straw laid to absorb dampness. Dom Afonso had devoted an entire passage of his manual to this stage. Paper, though born of river, must not return to it. The warehouse was to be kept dry but not barren, cool but not cold. Each ream was laid flat upon cedar shelves, for cedar, he claimed, deterred both mold and forgetfulness. Once stored, the royal recorders began the second ritual of inscription, recording the arrival of the very thing upon which they would later record all else. This was the paradox of the trade. Paper existed to contain words, yet first it had to generate them. The clerks wrote lists of the sheets themselves, their dimensions, their origins, their watermarks, creating an endless reflection of paper describing paper, ink defining its own necessity. Many of these ledgers survive today in fragments, the handwriting slanted, the ink browned with age. Reading them is like listening to the heartbeat of bureaucracy. From here, the distribution began. Requests came from every wing of the court, the chancery, the archives, the royal library, the naval bureau, the confessor's study. Each petition for supply was signed, countersigned, sealed, and sent back to the warehouse. Even the smallest sheet required documentation. To the modern eye, such formality appears excessive. But to the Portuguese administrators of the 17th century, order was a form of devotion. Paper was the skin of the kingdom, its handling, a sacrament. And so, under candlelight, the clerks prepared the allocations. Sheets were counted by hand, corners aligned with precision, stacks wrapped and bound with string. The manual stated, "Let the bundle breathe once before sealing, for air is the soul of record." This small pause, a minute, perhaps two, became part of the rhythm of the royal bureaucracy. An empire paused to let its pages breathe. In the long corridors of the Ribera Palace, servants carried these bundles through echoing halls to the offices of ministers and scribes. The sound of paper accompanied them like a faint echo, a rustle, a whisper. Behind every proclamation, every royal letter, lay this invisible system of movement and care. To ensure that the king's word could exist upon the world, an entire network of rivers, mills, animals, and men had to remain in perfect balance. Occasionally, shipments arrived damaged, damp from rain, torn by careless handling. When that happened, the warehouse fell into a strange solemnity. The defective sheets were brought into the courtyard and laid upon stone tables. Inspectors examined them one by one, marking the ruined with charcoal. Then, as evening fell, they were burned. The fire was slow and blue, and those present removed their hats. The ashes, as the manual dictated, were gathered into a clay vessel and carried to the monastery of São Vicente de Fora, where they were buried near the river. "Let them return to their first element," the manual said, "for from water they came, and by water they shall be forgiven." To witness this ritual was to understand the strange intimacy between paper and belief. Every act of destruction carried an echo of mercy, every act of creation, an echo of obedience. In the silence that followed, the smell of ash mingled with the scent of cedar, filling the air with something indefinably sacred. It is said that Dom Afonso himself attended such ceremonies in secret, standing among the clerks, his hands folded behind his back. He was not a man of emotion, but those who saw him claimed his eyes followed the smoke as though tracing the departure of something personal, the breath of a world he served yet never ruled. In his marginal notes, discovered centuries later, one finds a curious reflection: the kingdom is bound not by law, nor gold, nor arms, but by the fibers that remember touch. He seemed to believe that the essence of governance lay not in decree but in texture, that power itself was a matter of grain, density, and the quiet resistance of paper beneath ink. As the 17th century waned, and Portugal's empire stretched across oceans, the demand for paper grew relentless. The mills could scarcely keep pace. Forests thinned, rivers slowed, the hands that beat the rags grew old. Yet the system endured, its rhythm as inevitable as tide. For the royal court required that its memory never falter. And so, night after night, the mills continued to hum, the carters continued to climb, the clerks continued to count. The sound of their labor, hammer, hoof, and quill, wove itself into the vast, unseen fabric of empire. Those who listened closely, in the stillness between tasks, swore they could hear something else, the faint susurration of pages turning, as if the paper itself were reading. In the hush of dawn, when the Tagus still held the night's mist upon its back, the paper convoys began their descent. They moved in silence, save for the creak of oiled wood and the faint shuffle of ropes tightening under strain. The journey from the mills of Alcobaça and Leiria toward Lisbon was a ritual in itself, one bound not merely by geography but by a centuries-old choreography of trust, secrecy, and repetition. The royal clerks might have called it a logistical enterprise, a matter of ledgers and contracts. Yet to those who worked its currents, the bargemen, warehouse keepers, and dockside scribes, it was something far more sacred. It was the slow heartbeat of the Portuguese crown, pulsing through its rivers in sheets of white gold. Each bale of paper was wrapped with an almost monastic care. Thin cords bound the packages in crosshatch patterns, sealed with wax imprints bearing the insignia of the royal supplier. Even the smell of them was distinctive, a mingling of linen pulp, oak barrels, damp rope, and sea air. The clerks in the Office of Supplies claimed they could tell genuine royal paper by scent alone, that faint ghost of river water and sun-bleached rag. When the first rays of the morning reached the moored boats, they illuminated rows upon rows of parcels glinting faintly through the fog, as if the river itself carried treasure meant not for trade but for history's keeping. The rivermen were anonymous yet essential figures, brown hands roughened by rope burn, faces rarely glimpsed by the courtly elite. They navigated the slow, unpredictable currents with the precision of priests performing a rite. A misplaced turn, a delay by tide or storm, could ripple through the royal chancellery's operations for weeks. The king's decrees waited on those waters, treaties and edicts, naval charts, invitations to the nobility, all depended upon the arrival of those pale, silent cargoes. To falter was to court disaster. Thus, superstition grew around the trade. Some boatmen refused to set off without touching the carved saint at the prow, others whispered to the Tagus itself, calling it the long clerk, a keeper of secrets who demanded tribute in spilled ink or lost parcels. Each voyage began not at the mill, but in the ledgers of the royal scribes. The Manual do Fornecimento de Papel, the supply manual, dictated every step of the operation. It was an evolving text, rewritten over generations, its parchment margins filled with cautious amendments in ink now faded to sepia. It detailed how many bales could safely be loaded before a barge lost its buoyancy, how often the cords must be inspected for rot, which port officials should receive the shipments and which routes were forbidden during monsoon tides. To read it was to glimpse the mind of an empire obsessed with order. Yet, for all its precision, the manual could not account for the vagaries of wind, current, and human frailty. In the archives of the Royal Treasury, still kept under lock, lies an entry from the year 1713 describing a disaster. The cargo of Alcobaça, it reads, did not arrive. The river took it. The men, too. No further details follow, only the stamped seal of the overseer and a brief marginal note, replace within the fortnight, or the presses will stand idle. The tone is cold, detached, as though the drowning of 3 men and the loss of an entire barge's paper were mere technical inconveniences. Yet among the dockside communities, the story survived differently. They spoke of a fog so thick that the river seemed to vanish, of ghostly shapes following the barge upriver, and of pages later found floating near the marshes, each sheet marked with faint handprints, as though something beneath the water had tried to grasp the cargo before it sank. Despite such tales, the system endured. Each month, new consignments followed the same routes, policed by officials who wore their secrecy like armor. The royal bureaucracy was not merely concerned with delivery, it sought to control knowledge itself. Paper was not just a commodity but a conduit of authority, the medium through which the crown asserted its divine and administrative power. Every decree that bore the royal seal began life as pulp, churned in the mills of men who would never read the words it carried. There was a strange poetry in that, a cycle of ignorance and enlightenment intertwined, of hands that made without knowing. The mills themselves were worlds apart from the quiet grandeur of Lisbon. In the narrow valleys of central Portugal, where water fell in silver ribbons through moss-dark ravines, the papermakers lived to the rhythm of wheel and hammer. Their craft was ancient, adapted from Moorish techniques brought centuries earlier. The sound of the mallets pounding linen and hemp into paste filled the air with a dull heartbeat that echoed for miles. They worked by candlelight long into the evening, stirring vats where rags dissolved into fibrous streams. The foremen were vigilant, no tool was to be left rusting, no vat allowed to stagnate, for a single impurity could mar an entire batch. And above all, no sheet bearing the royal watermark could leave the premises unaccounted for. A watermarked sheet was more than mere identification, it was a declaration of sovereignty. The pattern, pressed by hand through fine mesh, often depicted the royal crest, or sometimes a subtle variation used only for confidential documents. The artisans never spoke of how these designs were chosen or changed, yet rumors abounded. Some said that the watermark's intricacies concealed hidden sigils, that certain papers bore invisible signatures known only to the archivists of the crown. Others whispered that the patterns shifted slightly with each generation of ruler, not by design but as if the monarchy itself subtly altered its reflection upon the page. Once produced, the sheets were pressed, dried, and sorted under lamplight. The air in those storage rooms was always damp, smelling of starch and beeswax. Men with ink-stained fingers checked each stack for imperfections, sliding their palms across the surface to feel for the slightest roughness. Those unfit for court use were sold cheaply to provincial scribes, monasteries, or merchant guilds. The rest, the flawless reams, were marked for royal shipment and carried under watchful escort down the valley paths toward the Tagus. Transport was its own ordeal. Mules bore the bales along roads carved by centuries of rain and toil. Travelers described the sight of caravans snaking through the dawn mist, rows of beasts draped in burlap, led by figures whose faces were always turned away. At the relay points, inspectors compared each tally with the master list. The lists themselves were treated as sacred documents, sealed in red wax, and carried separately to prevent tampering. Once the convoy reached the river, the transformation began anew, cargo became current, rope became lifeline, and all hands turned toward the city's pull. As the barges drifted toward Lisbon, the soundscape changed. The roar of the mills faded, replaced by the hum of the capital, distant bells, gulls crying over the harbor, and the low thunder of waves meeting stone. From the decks, one could glimpse the city rising like a pale mirage, its tiled rooftops shimmering in the haze. The royal palace stood above it all, serene and aloof, its windows catching the morning sun. Few of the bargemen ever set foot inside those marble halls, yet all felt its weight upon them. Their cargo was not theirs to understand, it was destined for hands that would write decrees shaping nations. By the time the barges docked at the Alfama quay, the cargo was already logged, stamped, and scheduled for inspection. The clerks who met them wore gloves and spoke in hushed tones, as though afraid to disturb the stillness within the bales. The paper was unloaded into covered wagons, escorted by guards from the Royal Custody Office, and taken up the winding streets toward the archives. There, behind thick oak doors, it would rest until needed. To the casual observer, the process seemed mundane, just another trade route among many that kept the machinery of empire turning. Yet for those who watched closely, there was something uncanny in its rhythm. The same faces, the same motions, repeated endlessly, generation after generation. The same river swallowing light at dawn, the same bales stacked beneath the same seals. The bureaucracy of paper had outlived kings, earthquakes, and wars. It was as though the system itself had attained a kind of immortality, an organism of ink and fiber that fed upon human obedience. At night, when the docks lay silent and the ledgers were closed, the faint rustle of paper could still be heard in the warehouses, soft, irregular, like breathing. The watchman said it was only the wind, but some avoided those halls altogether. They claimed that every sheet bore memory, that the fibers retained echoes of every hand that had touched them, every word that would one day be written upon them. To walk among them in darkness was to walk amid unborn thoughts, waiting to be spoken by the king. And so, the river kept flowing, day after day, century after century, carrying with it not just goods but intentions. The royal court might have believed it controlled the process, yet the truth was subtler. The system had become self-sustaining, a quiet empire within an empire, where paper ruled men as much as men ruled paper. The barges returned upstream, empty and creaking, their hulls smelling faintly of pulp and thyme. And on the morning tides, new cargoes came again, pale and perfect, ready to serve the endless appetite of the crown. Deep within the limestone foundations of the Ribera Palace, beneath the glittering corridors and echoing salons of courtly ceremony, the royal archive slept. It was not an archive in the modern sense, where scholars turn pages under gentle light. It was a subterranean labyrinth, a living organism of parchment and ink. The air was thick with the fragrance of thyme, salt, glue, candle soot, and the faint sweetness of paper aging slowly into fragility. Every corner of that underground world was governed by ritual. The archivists moved as if they were monks, their footsteps muffled, their hands wrapped in cloth to guard against the oils of skin. To touch the king's paper was to risk the slow decay of history itself. The royal archivists were known by title, not by name. Their records called them custodians of the word, a rank both sacred and obscure. They were sworn to silence, not by force, but by the gravity of their vocation. They kept the living catalogue of all paper entering and leaving the crown's possession, decrees, letters, maps, even the secret inventories of foreign agents. Each sheet was logged by hand in the Livro Branco, the white book, so named for the unmarked vellum upon which its entries were written. Its pages were heavy and luminous, turned only at the rising and setting of the sun. For centuries, the white book expanded, its edges darkening like the veins of an old tree. It was said that the first custodian had designed the archive after a dream, a vision of shelves that grew downward into the earth, winding through stone like roots seeking the bones of kings. Whether true or not, the layout reflected a strange logic. The oldest records lay deepest, far below the river's level, where moisture turned air to mist. The newest papers rested near the upper halls, in chambers lined with cedar and brass. Between them stretched corridors that no outsider could traverse without a guide. There were whispers that entire sections had been sealed after the earthquake of 1755, their contents entombed with the dust of fallen saints. The logistics of paper for the royal court depended entirely upon this network. Every incoming shipment from the river was first inspected by the custodians before being distributed to the relevant offices, Chancellery, Naval Bureau, Treasury, and ecclesiastical records. Each department had its own watermark and a strict allotment based on necessity and rank. The Chancellery consumed the largest share, its scribes producing endless streams of decrees and memoranda. The Naval Bureau's needs were more material: charts, navigational records, manifests. The Treasury's usage was paradoxically small but of immense importance: ledgers, treaties, and contracts that bound kingdoms together. Every sheet sent to those rooms passed first through the silent judgment of the custodians. Their rituals were exacting. Before any bale could be opened, the supervising archivist would press a seal of heated bronze into a shallow bowl of beeswax. The scent of wax and smoke filled the chamber as he murmured the verification number aloud, an incantation of numbers, syllables, and archaic abbreviations. Only after this was done could the cords be cut and the paper removed, one ream at a time. Each stack was then examined for irregularities, discoloration, moisture damage, or improper watermark placement. A single sheet out of alignment could result in the rejection of an entire shipment. What the clerks called quality control, the custodians treated as spiritual cleansing. They believed that flawed paper carried flawed intention, that the king's word, when written on impure material, might lose its divine authority. Thus, beneath the splendor of Portugal's empire, an invisible hierarchy thrived. Above ground were the orators and courtiers, whose voices shaped policy and decree. Below, in the lamplit vaults, were those who ensured that every word had substance, that the physical vessel of language remained unbroken. Their labor was uncelebrated, but indispensable. The archives were the lungs of empire, drawing in breath with each decree, exhaling with each recorded act of obedience. Over time, the archives developed peculiar habits of their own. The custodians began to notice subtle patterns: certain reams yellowed faster than others, certain ink faded unpredictably, and in the deepest levels, faint moisture stains formed in the shapes of symbols no one could explain. Some interpreted them as watermarks bleeding through, others as messages impressed by the hand of Providence. A few, in hushed tones, claimed that the paper itself was alive, that it absorbed not only ink but intention, memory, perhaps even the residue of thought. When a royal edict was revoked, the corresponding record seemed to tremble, its edges curling as if recoiling from shame. The belief gained quiet traction among the lower ranks, who whispered that the royal archive listened. They claimed that at night, the air quivered with faint murmurs, the shuffle of unseen pages turning themselves. The master custodian forbade such talk, calling it superstition unfit for servants of the crown. Yet even he was seen lighting a candle in the deepest vaults before leaving, a gesture of respect, or perhaps of appeasement. The logistics of record-keeping had grown so intricate that by the late 17th century, the archives had effectively become a second government, one that dealt not in policy but in preservation. The custodians controlled the issuance of blank paper, the authorization of official seals, and the destruction of outdated documents. To lose a record without authorization was treason. To misplace even a single page bearing the royal crest could result in imprisonment. And so, men and women of the archive grew cautious, deliberate, almost inhumanly precise. Their handwriting was small and uniform, their speech slow, their days measured not by sunlight but by the turning of inventory ledgers. Each shipment of paper was thus both a physical delivery and a renewal of the empire's pulse. When the supply slowed, whether by storm, shortage, or political unrest, the entire system faltered. Letters went unwritten. Orders were delayed. The king's word could not travel without its vessel. One could trace, through the gaps in the record, the faint echo of wider crises, wars, failed harvests, outbreaks of disease. In years when the Tagus flooded or mills fell silent, royal correspondence dwindled to a trickle. It was as if the crown itself had momentarily forgotten how to speak. During one such period of scarcity in 1684, a substitute method was devised. The archive began reusing paper from outdated proclamations, scraping ink from the surface with fine pumice stones and smoothing it anew with egg white and linen cloth. The result was serviceable but ghostly. Beneath the fresh inscriptions, faint remnants of the previous text sometimes remained, shadow words, half visible when held to the light. These palimpsests caused unease among the scribes, for occasionally, the faint undertext seemed prophetic. Orders written upon them were said to bring misfortune, treaties that failed, ships that vanished, alliances that dissolved overnight. Eventually, the practice was abandoned, and the remaining sheets were buried in sealed chests beneath the lower vaults. Even in times of abundance, the archives demanded constant vigilance. Mice, mold, fire, all were enemies of continuity. The custodians kept cats within the halls, sleek and silent creatures that prowled between stacks of paper like living shadows. It was rumored that they, too, were recorded, each given a number, each death noted in the margins of the daily log. The cats outlived several generations of archivists, and their descendants remained long after the original staff had turned to dust. Some visitors, centuries later, would swear they saw them still, watching from dark corners where no lamp reached. Above ground, Lisbon's palace life carried on in its dazzling rhythm: banquets, operas, audiences, and processions. Below, in the world of paper, the rhythm was slower but no less grand. When a decree was signed by the king, the custodians received it as priests receive communion. The sheet was measured, stamped, and placed in a special casing of silk and pine. It was then recorded in 3 separate ledgers, one for issuance, one for distribution, one for eternity. The last, sealed in wax, was stored in the chamber of the unending record, a circular room with no corners, lined entirely in scrolls. To stand there was to feel time dissolve, the weight of empire compressed into whisper-thin layers of fiber and ink. It was in that chamber that an odd discovery occurred around the year 1739. A custodian, newly appointed, reported finding an unmarked ledger, its spine plain, its pages pristine, its presence unrecorded in any index. Within it were lists of shipments, complete with signatures and quantities, corresponding to years long past. Yet when cross-checked, the river ledgers bore no trace of them. Hundreds of bales, dozens of voyages, vanished from official record. The entries were written in a hand too fine, too deliberate, to belong to any known scribe. The master custodian ordered the book sealed and placed under lock. He wrote a brief note beside the entry, perhaps a mistake of duplication. But some whispered another explanation, that the book belonged not to the past, but to a future that had never occurred. Whatever the truth, the mystery lingered. The archive, it seemed, had begun writing its own history. Whether by human error, divine will, or the sentience of paper itself, the system had transcended control. And so, as night settled over the river and the barges once again carried their pale cargoes toward the capital, the Royal Archive waited below, dreaming in fiber and silence. Its shelves stretched beyond sight, filled with the breath of centuries. Each page, blank or written, was a potential world, a landscape of ink awaiting the tremor of a quill. And though no one could hear it from the marble halls above, the archive murmured softly to itself, the sound of countless papers shifting as if stirred by an invisible hand. It was the whisper of a nation remembering its own words, of a crown that ruled not through speech but through the endless, restless quiet of its paper soul. By the early 18th century, the system for supplying paper to the Portuguese royal court had grown into something vast and nearly incomprehensible. It no longer belonged entirely to men of the crown, nor to merchants or millers, but to an invisible network of intermediaries who traced maps not upon parchment, but within the folds of bureaucracy itself. These were the royal cartographers of supply, not geographers in the traditional sense, but silent architects of movement and material. They charted the invisible geography of logistics, where paper came from, where it flowed, and through whose hands it passed. And though they dealt in ledgers, lists, and letters, their work carried the strange aura of secret navigation, as though each bale of paper followed not a trade route, but a pilgrimage. From Lisbon outward, the crown's influence stretched across oceans and continents, toward Goa, Bahia, Angola, and Macau. Yet even at the center of empire, the flow of paper remained a delicate and mysterious operation. To sustain its constant hunger, the court required maps, treaties, inventories, and decrees, all copied and recopied in immaculate script. For this, the supply of paper had to be as reliable as the tide. The Crown's bureaucrats called it the chain of fiber, a phrase that captured both the physical substance of their medium and the invisible tension of its journey. Each sheet was the final link in a chain that began far from the palace, among the rags and tatters of the poor. It was a strange inversion of social order. The garments of beggars and servants, once soiled and discarded, became the raw material for royal communication. Rags were bought by itinerant collectors who roamed the countryside with carts, calling out their trade in low, rhythmic tones, panos velhos. Panos para o moinho. Old cloth for the mill. They were often former soldiers or widowers, men whose names no longer appeared in parish books. The rags they gathered would be sorted by women in dim courtyards, who separated them by color and texture, stripping away buttons, seams, and memories. To handle those remnants was to touch the ghost of someone's life, yet there was no sentimentality in the task, only the endless repetition of necessity. From these humble beginnings, the paper's journey ascended through layers of craft and command. The mills along the Lys and Alcoa rivers transformed the rags into pulp, the pulp into sheets, and the sheets into bales bound for the court. But what few understood was that the transport of these goods was not merely economic, it was cartographic. Each shipment followed a path as rigorously measured as any explorer's route across the sea. The distances between mill and port, the weight each mule could carry, the precise timing of tides at the Tagus estuary, all were charted, recorded, and cross-referenced in elaborate documents that resembled maps of an unseen territory. In a small chamber near the customs house, there existed what the clerks called the map of fibers. It was drawn on vellum so large that it covered an entire table, and its lines shimmered faintly when touched by lamplight. To the untrained eye, it appeared to be a web of intersecting routes connecting mills, depots, and royal offices. But to those who knew how to read it, it was something more profound, a representation of power itself. Each line indicated not just a path but an obligation, who owed whom, which department governed which route, where oversight began and ended. The map was not concerned with distance, but with dependence. According to legend, the map was created by a certain João de Encarnação, an administrator of genius and paranoia who served under King João V. He was said to have memorized every road and waterway from Leiria to Lisbon, every convoy schedule, every signature on every receipt. In his final years, obsessed with the fear of mismanagement, he began to record the system visually, creating a labyrinth of ink lines that spiraled inward like a seashell. When he died, the map was sealed in a cedar frame and kept under royal protection. To this day, no one has found a copy that matches its detail. The original was rumored to have burned during the 1755 earthquake, but some whispered that a duplicate remained hidden in the archives, folded within a bale of blank paper, waiting to be rediscovered by accident, or by destiny. The strange thing about this system was how self-perpetuating it became. Each generation of administrators inherited the previous one's charts, adjusted a few lines, and added new annotations in increasingly cryptic handwriting. The routes themselves evolved, rivers silted, roads shifted, bridges collapsed and were rebuilt elsewhere. Yet the maps persisted, accumulating contradictions like sediment. The result was an uncanny document that no longer reflected the real geography of Portugal, but rather the imagined one sustained by the Crown's desire for order. The bureaucracy had become a map of itself, a recursive structure of ink and intention. And within that structure, men began to vanish. Not in the literal sense, though accidents were common, but within the paperwork itself. A courier might disappear from the rolls, his name erased by a line of ink. A shipment might arrive with no signature, existing in a liminal space between acknowledgement and denial. These anomalies were noted but rarely investigated. The Crown's officials simply adjusted their records, adding marginal notes in a calm, bureaucratic hand, irregularity resolved. Yet somewhere along the line, the missing paper would resurface, appearing months or even years later in the archive, perfectly accounted for, as though it had traveled through time rather than space. Some believed there was a reason for this, a hidden layer within the logistics network. Beneath the legitimate flow of goods ran another, invisible current. Certain parcels were said to carry not blank sheets but coded messages, invisible ink recipes, or forbidden texts imported from foreign presses. The same ships that brought paper from Genoa or Rouen might also smuggle philosophical treatises banned by the Inquisition. The custodians of the Royal Archive knew of this but pretended not to. It was safer that way. The system was too vast, too intricate, to purify. Its corruption was not an intrusion but a condition of its being. At times, even the paper itself seemed to betray knowledge of this duplicity. Some shipments arrived with faint impressions of writing upon them, words and lines that had never been penned by human hand. Under candlelight, these marks appeared like veins or topographical ridges, suggesting that the paper was slowly mapping itself, as if recording the paths it had traveled. The archivists noted these phenomena in their secret logs, referring to them as cartas phantasma, ghost sheets. No one could explain how they came to be, yet they were always set aside, never used for royal decrees. To write upon them was considered unlucky, even dangerous. A few found their way into private collections, where collectors claimed that if left under the moon, the ghost maps would continue to change, lines shifting, destinations fading, as though the paper itself were still in motion. Meanwhile, above the ground, the royal court continued its routines of ceremony and decree. Ministers argued over colonial trade routes, diplomats signed treaties on the very sheets born from beggars' rags, and poets composed verses for the Queen's name-day festivities. Yet none of them suspected that beneath their signatures lay the faint traces of an invisible geography, a network of human effort, superstition, and quiet endurance. Every piece of correspondence, every royal edict, was an intersection in that unseen web. At the height of summer, when the air grew heavy with humidity, the paper itself seemed to breathe. The sheets swelled slightly in their bindings, exhaling faint scents of linen and dust. The custodians worked by candlelight, listening to the slow drip of water from the vaults above. They spoke little, but each understood the system's rhythm, as if the flow of paper had entered their bloodstream. Some had served so long they could predict the arrival of new shipments by instinct alone, feeling a subtle shift in the air when barges approached the quay. Their bodies had become instruments of logistics, human barometers attuned to the tides of empire. And still, the map expanded. New marks appeared in the ledgers, connecting distant colonies and unknown suppliers. Shipments of exotic fibers, bamboo, rice straw, mulberry, began arriving from the east, tested in secret by royal order. Experiments in waterproof parchment and invisible watermarking occupied the attention of the crown's alchemists. What began as an administrative necessity was becoming an art, a metaphysical science. The royal paper was no longer merely the medium of governance, it was becoming a mirror of empire itself, vast, fragile, and perpetually unfinished. No one knew precisely when the idea of the secret annex first appeared. It was said to be a chamber beneath the main archive, accessible only to 3 men at a time. Within it were kept the documents deemed too sensitive to exist. Some spoke of correspondence between monarchs sealed in foreign blood, others of maps not of land, but of influence, schematics of human allegiance, drawn as if geography were psychological rather than physical. According to rumor, the paper used in the annex came from a mill that no longer appeared in any record, its location erased from official maps. Some said it had never existed at all, that its output came from nowhere and yet supplied the heart of empire. By the end of the 18th century, the logistics of paper had reached their most refined and most fragile form. Every bale was accounted for, every route traced, every watermark logged. And yet the system had grown so intricate that it had ceased to serve its original purpose. The bureaucracy fed itself, consuming vast amounts of energy merely to maintain its own precision. In some ways, the supply of paper no longer served the crown, it served the concept of continuity, the illusion that order could be eternal. Still, the barges came. Still, the mills turned. And in the dim chambers where clerks copied maps of maps, the air trembled faintly with dust and the faint rustle of paper shifting on its own. The system had become both machine and ghost, a living cartography of empire, inscribed not upon the land but upon the thin, breathing skin of the page. By the time the packages of paper reached Lisbon's docks, the long arm of the royal bureaucracy had already begun to stir. Within the low-lit archives of the Casa de India, clerks moved silently, their quills trembling like nervous birds over ledgers filled with names, measures, and routes. Each entry, though small and unassuming, carried within it the weight of oceans, the price of storms, the friction of mule hooves, the exhaustion of forest hands. Paper, once a raw skin of flax and rags, had become now a living currency that flowed through channels unseen, feeding the appetite of the Portuguese royal court. It was in these corridors that distribution itself became an art, a choreography of hidden maps, coded receipts, and deliberate delays, all stitched together by men who understood that paper was not merely substance, but symbol. The distribution routes across Lisbon were both obvious and invisible. Along the main arteries of the city, mule-drawn carts and low-wheeled carriages rolled between storehouses and palaces, their loads covered by dull canvas to disguise the gleam of white beneath. But beyond this public display existed another system, a shadowed web of passageways threading through monasteries, merchant guild halls, and forgotten tunnels beneath the Alfama. Paper for the royal archives did not travel by the same hands that carried letters to the king. Paper for the religious orders passed through routes sanctified by silence. Every bale was tracked, but not every bale was declared. In the quiet of the night, near the Barro Alto, a small procession might begin, two men bearing crates stamped with nothing more than a wax symbol, a crown split by a quill. They would move through alleys where lamplight barely touched the cobblestones, crossing bridges where the Tagus shimmered below, then vanish into the heavy doors of a convent or the waiting shadows of a carriage. These were not smugglers, but functionaries, silent participants in the great balancing act of court supply. The monarchy's hunger for paper was insatiable, yet its budgets were fickle. As a result, much of Lisbon's papermaking and supply survived on informal understandings, arrangements that blurred the line between legality and necessity. The most delicate shipments were reserved for the royal scriptoria, where clerks prepared the decrees that carried Portugal's name into every corner of its empire. These were not ordinary sheets, but the finest paper, smooth as calm water and scented faintly with starch and rose oil. To deliver such material required precision. The sheets had to arrive uncreased, unmarked, and untouched by the damp breath of the ocean. Thus, a secondary route was devised, a path through the city's highest quarters, where the air was drier and the streets narrower. Only a select group of couriers knew the way. They bore their cargoes wrapped in oiled linen and carried letters of passage signed by the royal chamberlain himself. At the receiving end of this labyrinthine network stood the Office of Paper Distribution, housed in a modest stone building near the Rua dos Douradores. Its facade revealed nothing of its importance. Inside, the air smelled of ink and beeswax, the floorboards groaned with the weight of ledgers, and a single bell marked each hour's passing with solemn regularity. The clerks who worked there spoke little, for they had learned that silence was safer than speculation. Yet among them, stories persisted, of vanished crates, of counterfeit sheets slipping into official use, of documents written on paper that was never recorded in the royal accounts. It was whispered that some of the most influential men in Lisbon profited quietly from these disappearances. The paper that went missing did not vanish into the sea or the flames, it simply reappeared elsewhere, in the hands of notaries, poets, or foreign diplomats. The black market for royal paper was both lucrative and dangerous. It thrived in the interstices of bureaucracy, in the moments when ink took too long to dry or an overseer's gaze turned away. Those who participated in it risked ruin, but they also understood something profound. Paper was the bloodstream of power, and to control its flow was to control the rhythm of authority itself. As the century deepened and the machinery of empire grew more complex, the logistics of distribution evolved into something like ritual. Every stage of the process, from arrival to inventory, from allocation to delivery, was marked by ceremonial gestures meant to ensure order and ward off corruption. A crate could not be opened without the presence of two witnesses. Every ream had to be stamped with the royal crest, even those destined for private correspondence. Yet these gestures, though meant to preserve purity, also created distance. The men who counted the sheets rarely saw them used, and those who wrote upon them never imagined the forests and sweat behind each page. By the mid-1700s, the royal court had developed a taste for luxury stationery imported from France and Italy. These sheets, fine and faintly translucent, bore watermarks of lilies, crowns, or mythical creatures. They were used for diplomatic correspondence and declarations of royal births, their smooth surfaces a quiet testament to wealth and refinement. The Portuguese suppliers, unable to match this level of finish, shifted their focus inward. They became masters of logistics rather than manufacture, experts in storage, humidity, and transport. It was said that some could predict a paper's future condition simply by smelling it upon arrival. In warehouses near the Terreiro do Paco, where the river's salt hung heavy in the air, men labored to keep the paper safe from damp. Charcoal braziers burned day and night to dry the atmosphere, while layers of linen were draped between stacks to absorb moisture. The sound of rustling sheets was constant, like a soft, continuous whisper. To stand there for long was to feel as though one were inside a living thing, a creature of endless breath and quiet movement. The overseers moved carefully among the aisles, their lanterns throwing brief halos across the bound stacks, as though illuminating some sacred archive of invisible knowledge. Beyond Lisbon, in the royal estates of Mafra and Queluz, other forms of distribution took place. Paper destined for the court's distant residences traveled under guard, protected not for its monetary value but for its symbolic one. To deliver writing material to a royal retreat was to affirm that the king's voice reached even the remotest corners of his domain. At times, these convoys passed through villages where the sight of white paper seemed almost miraculous, a substance of privilege and secrecy. Farmers would pause in their work to watch the carts go by, unaware that the cargo they glimpsed would soon bear decrees shaping their own lives. Even within the court, the act of distributing paper carried a certain weight. Servants brought it into chambers wrapped in linen, presenting it with the same reverence given to fine silver or wine. The scribes handled it as though it might bruise. Each page's surface offered both promise and peril, the power to record, to erase, to condemn. The courtiers, immersed in their intrigues and ceremonies, seldom reflected on this fragility. But occasionally, in the still hours of night, when a candle guttered and the sound of quills filled the silence, one might sense it, the faint hum of the empire's logistics pulsing beneath the polished floors, a heartbeat sustained by unseen labor. As years passed, the system adapted to change but never truly modernized. When the earthquake of 1755 struck Lisbon, destroying vast portions of the city and its archives, it was not the marble palaces or gilded icons that the surviving clerks mourned most, it was the paper. The fire that followed consumed centuries of decrees, inventories, and letters. The loss was incalculable, not only for its administrative chaos but for what it revealed, that an empire's continuity depended upon the delicate fibers of flax and rag. In the weeks that followed, distribution was reborn from ashes. The surviving papermakers redoubled their efforts, and within months, the first post-earthquake shipments began arriving once more at the reconstructed docks. Those who rebuilt the system did so with reverence. They created new safeguards, waterproof crates, redundant ledgers, and secret copies stored in monasteries beyond the city's reach. Yet even as these improvements were made, the same ancient vulnerabilities persisted. Paper, for all its resilience, remained mortal. It could be stained, torn, or lost. And behind every reform stood the same invisible hands, still tracing the same routes through the city's underbelly, still whispering in the language of caution and delay. In the candlelight of the rebuilt office of distribution, one could almost feel the echo of the past, the breath of the old clerks, the sigh of vanished shipments, the faint vibration of quills scratching across new beginnings. Lisbon itself had become a palimpsest, its streets layered with history, its ledgers inscribed with the memory of fire and flood. The logistics of paper had transformed from a mere supply system into a philosophy, a way of understanding impermanence through the fragile medium that preserved it. And so the rhythm continued, from mill to cart, from dock to archive, from hand to hand, in a cycle as silent as prayer. The men who served this rhythm did not speak of it, but they carried its gravity in their gestures, the slow lifting of a crate, the careful turning of a key, the reverent folding of a cloth. To them, paper was not merely a tool of empire, but its reflection. It recorded everything, yet understood nothing. It obeyed the currents of ink and order, yet remained always susceptible to wind, flame, and time. As night descended over Lisbon, the last cart of the day creaked toward the palace gates. The air was cool, the lamps flickered, and the scent of the Tagus drifted inland. Somewhere within the royal chambers, a clerk prepared to write the next decree, unaware that the sheet beneath his hand had traveled farther, and endured more, than any of the words it would bear. Outside, the couriers disappeared into darkness, their work done until dawn. The veins of distribution pulsed once more, unseen yet eternal, feeding the quiet heart of a kingdom that spoke in paper and silence. By the final decades of the 18th century, the act of supplying paper to the Portuguese royal court had become something beyond commerce. It was an economy of shadows, a delicate machinery balance between obedience and quiet rebellion. Those who worked within it no longer thought of their duties as transactions, but as vows. Paper, in this secret economy, was not a simple material but a conduit of consequence, every fiber bound to an intention, every shipment carrying the weight of unseen hands. The kingdom's appetite for documentation had grown insatiable. Every royal decree required multiple drafts, copies, and translations. The colonial offices in Brazil and Goa demanded constant correspondence. The clergy requested more sheets for sermons, the treasury for accounts, the naval offices for ship manifests and ledgers. Each demand echoed down the supply chain like the tolling of a distant bell, reaching all the way to the paper mills along the Mondego and Zizra rivers. And at every echo, someone's life adjusted slightly, a papermaker's hands grew more calloused, a scribe's eyes dimmed, a courier's mule aged a little faster on the stony roads. Yet amidst this unending rhythm of production and consumption, an invisible economy thrived. Beneath the surface of official transactions, the same material, the same bundles of paper, took on multiple identities. The royal court might commission 100 reams, 80 would arrive stamped and sealed, while 20 would vanish into miscellaneous ledgers, re-emerging under different names. These were the ghost sheets, the silent currency that passed through discreet hands to fund a world just beyond the court's notice. Within the dim rooms of Lisbon's merchant quarter, deals were made over candlelight, not of silver or spice, but of paper. A single ream bearing the royal watermark could be worth more than its weight in coin, for it carried with it an aura of legitimacy. With such paper, a false decree could be fashioned, a permit forged, a claim to land made official. And yet these forgeries were rarely used for open crime. They existed in a subtler realm, to protect, to correct, to smooth over bureaucratic obstacles. The same system that produced the empire's most sacred decrees also nourished the quiet resistance of those who lived beneath its weight. At the center of this economy were the corretores de papal, brokers who understood both the language of bureaucracy and the temperament of the mills. They were mediators between crown and commerce, ensuring that paper moved as silently as money. Their offices were unmarked, their ledgers written in cipher. They thrived in ambiguity, surviving through generations of wars, reforms, and royal deaths. Some had ties to the clergy, others to foreign traders. All shared one understanding, that whoever controlled the flow of paper controlled the rhythm of the realm. In the cool vaults of the royal chancery, the official version of this story was recorded in neat, unbroken columns. The registers listed every bail received, every crate inspected, every signature obtained. The handwriting was immaculate, the language flawless. But to those who read between the lines, the historians, the archivists, the sleepless clerks who handled these pages centuries later, the pattern was unmistakable. There were gaps where no gaps should be, sudden changes in ink, signatures that looked too careful. Even in perfection, there was the trace of deceit. Meanwhile, the papermakers themselves existed in a world half-lit by rumor and superstition. Some believed that the finest rags came from burial shrouds, washed and woven with care, others swore that the purity of paper depended on the silence of its maker. A few mills began to keep rituals, blessings whispered over vats of pulp, candles lit for safe transport. The owners, though practical men, allowed it. For they, too, had begun to sense that their trade brushed against something sacred. To shape the medium through which kings spoke was to participate, however humbly, in the shaping of history itself. In this climate of reverence and suspicion, the royal inspectors arrived. Their purpose was to restore order, to account for every bale, every shipment, every missing crate. They moved through the warehouses and mills like cold wind, examining stamps and ledgers, questioning overseers. Yet they could never quite grasp the full scope of what they sought. For the paper trade was not a chain but a labyrinth, and those within it had long ago learned how to leave no footprints. One such inspector, a man named Duarte Anselmo, spent years tracing the supply routes from Lisbon to the northern mills. His reports, preserved in fragments, tell of long nights by the river, of barges gliding silently under moonlight, of warehouses that seemed to appear and vanish between visits. He described the papermakers as priests of an unnamed order, their workrooms echoing with the sound of dripping water and pulped linen. In his final notes, written before his sudden disappearance, he confessed a strange thought, that the paper itself resisted being counted, as though the act of enumeration dissolved its essence. It absorbs all things, he wrote, even the attempt to name it. The bureaucracy of the court responded to such mysticism with indifference. To them, paper was an inventory item, a commodity to be balanced against ink, wax, and sealing cords. But the clerks who handled it daily understood something subtler, that every act of writing carried a residue of its material. The texture of the sheet, the faint smell of lime, the translucence against candlelight, all of it seeped into the tone of the words written upon it. The decrees of kings were not merely dictated by politics, they were also shaped, in the smallest of ways, by the fibers of the page itself. Thus, the secret economy of fiber and ink grew not from conspiracy but from intimacy, from the countless, minute relationships between material and meaning. The papermaker's patience, the scribe's discipline, the courier's care, these invisible virtues infused the paper with an energy that outlasted the words it carried. Even when documents were lost to fire or time, something of that devotion seemed to linger, a quiet hum in the archives, a ghostly echo in the crackle of old parchment. In certain corners of Lisbon, there were whispers of a manuscript, a manual, compiled by generations of papermakers and courtiers, detailing the secret rites of supply and preservation. It was said to contain formulas for pulp composition, routes for safe delivery, and instructions for encoding shipments to evade corruption. Officially, it did not exist. Yet fragments appeared over the years, a note on humidity control written in the margin of a royal account, a coded list of names found sewn into a ledger's binding. These remnants suggested that beneath the practical art of paper supply lay a philosophy of endurance, a belief that through discipline and secrecy, the ephemeral could be made eternal. Meanwhile, the world beyond the court began to change. Enlightenment ideas seeped into Lisbon, carried by foreign traders and exiled thinkers. Printing presses multiplied, and with them, the demand for cheaper paper. What had once been the province of the elite now entered the lives of merchants, scholars, and even common citizens. The royal supply chain, long accustomed to privilege, found itself competing against the new hunger for knowledge. Yet in this competition, the old system endured, slower, more deliberate, like an ancient ritual refusing to yield to modern haste. The inspectors came again, now with new tools and reforms, determined to rationalize what remained of the empire's paper trade. They demanded clearer accounts, standardized measures, and mechanized production. But for every improvement, something ineffable was lost, the patient rhythm of handcraft, the quiet dignity of work done by feel rather than formula. The paper grew wider, smoother, cheaper, but its silence was different. The old papers had breathed, these new sheets merely waited. Still, in the deep rooms of the royal palace, a few scribes continued their ancient habits. They chose their quills carefully, tested the grain of each sheet against the light, and wrote with the steady pace of those who understood that time itself moved differently within the court's walls. To them, the supply network was more than logistics, it was a pulse, a reminder that every word of royal command depended upon unseen labor, upon rivers and trees and human breath. And beyond the palace gates, the invisible brokers and couriers continued their nocturnal work. They no longer served a single king, nor even a single institution. They served the continuity of paper itself, the endless exchange between matter and meaning, between permanence and decay. In their silence, they preserved what the empire itself could not, the delicate equilibrium between creation and disappearance. By century's end, when the archives of Lisbon once again filled with records and royal decrees, no one could tell precisely how much paper had passed through the system, how many bales lost, how many ghost shipments survived. Yet the documents endured. The paper bore its centuries with quiet patience, its fibers unchanged, its ink still breathing faintly under candlelight. And somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten storeroom or the hidden compartment of a desk, the secret manual of the papermakers waited, its pages untouched, its wisdom sleeping, waiting to be awakened by the gentle sound of turning paper. As the 18th century slipped quietly into the 19th, the Portuguese royal court's paper network persisted in its peculiar duality, half visible, half imagined. On the surface, it was a system of orders, receipts, and routes. Underneath, it was a living consciousness, a memory stitched together by the hands of those who never signed their names. By now, generations of clerks had come and gone, each trained to treat the movement of paper with almost liturgical precision. The crates arrived, the ledgers were signed, the sheets were unwrapped, and the words of empire flowed again. But something had changed, subtly, like a shift in the tide. The empire's borders had begun to dissolve, its colonies murmuring toward independence, and with them, the once fluid arteries of supply had begun to harden, to forget their own pulse. The royal court's reliance on paper was greater than ever, yet the meaning of that paper had grown fragile. Orders were still written, but fewer obeyed, decrees still sealed, but slower to reach their destinations. The paper mills upriver continued to send their cargoes, though the overseers sensed the decline in every delivery, smaller orders, delayed payments, the growing intrusion of foreign paper flooding the market. In their workshops, the papermakers spoke less and worked more mechanically, as though mimicking the machines that would soon replace them. Their vats still steamed, their rollers still turned, but the silence that filled their workrooms was different now. It was not the meditative quiet of old craft but the silence of waiting for an ending that everyone knew was coming. In the city, too, the texture of paper had changed. The old sheets, thick, creamy, woven with faint traces of linen thread, gave way to thinner stock, smoother but less alive. When touched, it lacked the warmth of handmade pulp. Scribes complained that the ink no longer adhered properly, that letters bled where once they would have rested neatly upon the surface. To the historian's eye, such a change might seem trivial. But for the men who wrote by candlelight in the royal chambers, it was as though the voice of the kingdom itself had grown unsteady. The tools of permanence had begun to betray the illusion of eternity. Still, the system continued, if not through loyalty, then through inertia. The couriers still made their rounds at dawn, delivering parcels wrapped in waxed cloth to the palace of Ajuda, to the monastery of São Vicente, to the newly established academies and embassies. The brokers still negotiated shipments by the light of oil lamps, pretending that the same old routes were secure. The ledgers were still updated, the receipts still signed. Yet, behind the gestures of continuity, there was a growing sense of unreality, a quiet recognition that the entire mechanism existed only because everyone agreed not to see its decay. Somewhere within this fading rhythm, the paper itself seemed to acquire a strange agency. Scholars who later studied these final ledgers remarked on the uncanny consistency of their tone, a calm, meticulous style, devoid of emotion, yet strangely imbued with sorrow. It was as if the clerks, through years of repetition, had become mediums for the paper they served. Their handwriting softened over time, their ink diluted by fatigue, until their records read more like prayer than account. The bureaucracy, once a fortress of logic, had become an archive of melancholy. Amidst this quiet unraveling, there emerged a peculiar figure known only by the initials, J.F. His name appears briefly in two surviving documents from 1796, both signed in an elegant, slightly trembling hand. According to scattered accounts, he was one of the last royal commissioners for material supply, charged with overseeing the transition from handcrafted to mechanized paper production. His correspondence reveals a man caught between two worlds, the tactile devotion of the old mills and the cold efficiency of the industrial future. In one letter, he described visiting a new press near Coimbra that could produce sheets faster than a dozen men combined. "It is marvelous," he wrote, "but I fear it makes ghosts of us all. The rhythm of our labor has become too smooth, too silent." Those words, preserved on the very paper he lamented, became an unintended epitaph for the era. The new machines did not sing like the mills of old, they hissed and shuddered, their rhythm mechanical rather than human. The pulp they produced was clean, uniform, lifeless. For the royal supply chain, it was a triumph of order. For the old craftsman, it was the end of meaning. Yet even in this transformation, traces of the past refused to vanish. Somewhere within the endless stacks of machine-pressed sheets, one could still find the occasional imperfection, a faint watermark from another age, a thread that resisted bleaching, a small air bubble that caught the light like memory itself. The royal officials, of course, cared little for such subtleties. Their concerns were practical, cost, volume, speed. But within the archives, where the clerks still tended to the old ledgers, something fragile persisted, a reverence for the continuity of form. They handled each new shipment with the same care as before, aligning the sheets into neat piles, recording the same annotations in the margins, humidity, texture, arrival time. They wrote not for themselves, nor even for the court, but for some unseen witness who would one day read these pages and understand the delicate symmetry between precision and loss. As the century turned, Lisbon's paper network became a relic of its own creation. The brokers disappeared, their codes forgotten, the secret manual, if it ever truly existed, faded into rumor. Some said it had been hidden inside a false wall in the royal library, others that it had been smuggled to Brazil along with the fleeing court during the Napoleonic invasions. A few believed it had been burned deliberately, not out of malice, but mercy. For to reveal its contents, they said, would be to expose the anatomy of an empire built upon fragile things. Yet whether the manual survived or not, its spirit lingered in the unbroken discipline of the supply. Even as revolutions reshaped Europe, even as monarchs fell and colonies slipped away, the shipments of paper continued to arrive, smaller, slower, but faithful. It was as if the system had become self-aware, continuing not because anyone commanded it, but because it no longer knew how to stop. The clerks changed uniforms, the seals changed crests, but the ledgers kept filling, line after line, until the act of writing itself became its own justification. There are accounts, faint, fragmentary, of a final delivery made sometime in the 1830s. By then, the court had transformed into something half ceremonial, half nostalgic. The old palace smelled of dust and candle grease. The scribes worked in rooms that no longer echoed with royal footsteps. Yet still, one last consignment of paper arrived by river, marked with a faded insignia, the same quill crown that had adorned shipments centuries before. The crates were opened, the paper inspected, the quality approved. But no orders followed. No decrees were written. The supply had outlived its purpose. In the years that followed, the paper yellowed quietly in its chests, untouched. Mice nested among the folded reams. Moisture curled the edges. The ledgers, however, remained immaculate. Someone, perhaps a final clerk, perhaps his apprentice, continued to record each crate's condition, long after the paperwork had ceased to matter. The handwriting slowed, grew smaller, then stopped mid-sentence. The last entry reads simply, "The stock is complete." No further instructions. Beneath it, a single ink blot, shaped uncannily like a tear. Historians who later uncovered these records in the palace basement described the sensation of reading them as dreamlike. The air was thick with dust, the light slanted through barred windows, and everywhere lay the soft rustle of paper shifting under its own age. Each page seemed to exhale a faint warmth, as though the memory of human touch still lingered in its fibers. It was difficult not to imagine the presence of those who had tended it, the papermakers, the couriers, the clerks, all gathered invisibly in the silence, their lives woven into the very substance they had once served. And perhaps, in some sense, they were. For in every civilization that has ever trusted its truth to paper, the same paradox endures, that permanence is an illusion maintained by fragile means. The Portuguese royal court, with all its rituals and precision, had sought to master transience through the logic of supply. Yet in doing so, it had created a mirror, a reflection of its own fragility in the very medium it revered. The paper endured, but the empire it served dissolved into the air. Now, when archivists unfold those ancient sheets, they find that the ink has faded to a soft gray, the edges translucent as breath. And yet the writing remains legible, serene, unhurried, impossibly calm. It speaks not of conquest or decree, but of the humble continuity of work. A system of hands, passing material through time, believing in the quiet dignity of repetition. The logistics that once sustained kings now sustain only silence. In the stillness of the archive, the air carries a peculiar scent, linen, dust, and the faint sweetness of old starch. If one listens long enough, it almost seems to hum, as though the paper itself remembers. Perhaps it does. Perhaps, somewhere in those fibers, the ancient rhythm persists, the turning of the wheel, the drying of pulp, the folding of bundles, the slow breathing of men at work. The sound of labor transformed into permanence. The empire may be gone, but the paper still dreams. And in that dream, the supply continues, endless, cyclical, serene, a ghostly system that no longer feeds a court, but sustains the memory of its own necessity. Every sheet, still waiting for ink, remains both empty and infinite. In the vast silence of the archives beneath Lisbon, where the air smells faintly of salt, ink, and dust, the last remnants of the Royal Paper Office rest in undisturbed layers. There are no voices there, no clerks or couriers rushing between the walls, no rustling of scrolls or echo of hoofbeats on cobblestone. Only the delicate pulse of time persists, like a soft tide brushing against the remnants of human labor. Each sheet, though yellowed and brittle, still retains a subtle weight, not merely of fiber and pulp, but of intention. The weight of centuries of record-keeping, of royal decrees, of whispered orders and sealed letters whose words once moved ships, armies, and lives. These papers no longer travel from mills to palaces, they rest as if exhaled from the lungs of empire, released into a sleep that mirrors the one now shared by those who made them. Long after the court disbanded, after the merchants vanished into the fog of history, after the canals dried and the docks shifted with silt and ruin, the paper remained. It is said that the archivists who once tended to these documents treated them as if they were alive. They whispered to them, dusted them gently, mended tears with silk thread as if suturing wounds. The great ledgers, bound in calfskin, recorded not the deeds of kings but the silent arithmetic of existence, the quantities, costs, and voyages that built the invisible spine of the kingdom. In those faded lines, one can still trace the faint lattice of an entire world's labor. One can almost sense the breath of the papermakers in Tomar, the measured pace of the mule drivers from Coimbra, the salt-rimed sweat of the sailors who ferried bundles downriver. The court itself, for all its majesty, was but the surface shimmer upon this hidden machinery. Beneath it moved a quieter kingdom, of ink and linen, of fiber and faith. When the archivists closed the final ledger of the Royal Paper Office, they did not write "Finis." They wrote only a date, a simple inscription marking the end of record, but not of memory. The paper that had once borne decrees of war and peace now carried nothing but the breath of stillness. Yet it is in that stillness that history breathes most deeply. The story of supplying paper to the Portuguese royal court was never about paper alone. It was about the movement of meaning, how something so fragile could carry the weight of power, love, deceit, and divine will. Every sheet that passed through those hands became an extension of the kingdom's soul, its promises, its lies. There is an old superstition among the few who still visit those archives. They say that if one listens closely in the long corridor after dusk, one can hear a faint scratching, the sound of quills writing in empty air. Some claim it is the echo of clerks who cannot stop recording, their hands continuing to tally and transcribe even after centuries have buried their names. Others say it is the paper itself, murmuring the words it once held, releasing them slowly as the fibers decay. But perhaps it is simply memory doing what it has always done, persisting, even when all reasons for persistence are gone. In that endless half-dark, a single lamp burns low over a table. Upon it lies a sheet of paper that never made its way to the court. It was produced in 1792 in a mill along the Tagus, inspected, stamped, and set aside for shipment, yet somehow, it remained behind. Its surface is blank, save for the watermark of the royal crest and the faint shadow of a moth's wing embedded in the pulp. Scholars have studied it with reverence, noting the precision of its fibers, the evenness of its tone. But what draws them most is the silence it seems to contain. A silence so deep that one can imagine it absorbing the last echoes of the empire itself. The Portuguese royal bureaucracy had long since understood that the true permanence of rule did not rest in gold or stone, but in the written word, and more importantly, in the materials that made the written word possible. Paper was the invisible currency of control, the medium through which the divine right of kings was recorded and renewed. Every order, every seal, every signature tethered the empire to its memory. And so the men and women who labored in this shadow trade, from the rag pickers who scavenged linen scraps in alleys, to the merchants who charted shipments across perilous seas, were all unwitting priests in this secular liturgy. They sustained the memory of a nation that believed its essence could be written, bound, and stored. Now, the old mills stand hollow along the rivers, their wheels stilled, their vats dry. Moss covers the beams, and the echo of dripping water replaces the hum of pulp. Yet in those ruins, the air still carries a certain sweetness, a faint trace of linen dust, of soaked fibers and oak ash, of the ghost of industry. If one were to step inside, one might see, beneath the debris, small flecks of white that glimmer when touched by sunlight through the cracks. Fragments of paper, perhaps. Or merely the illusion of it, the mind's attempt to summon what it misses. The archivists say that when a page decays, it does not disappear entirely. It dissolves into the air as a fine powder, mingling with dust and breath. And so, in some quiet way, the past becomes part of the present, inhaled without awareness. The air of Lisbon, they say, is thick with centuries of paper. Each particle a whisper of a royal decree, a letter, a confession, a poem. Every inhale draws history closer. In the stillness of the epilogue, the narrative folds upon itself. The great logistical manual that once guided the empire's paper trade becomes a dream of order and fragility intertwined. It is impossible to say where the story ends, for the logistics of memory are as endless as the tides that once bore the ships upstream. The scribes who once documented every bale and bundle are long gone, but their precision endures. In the margins of forgotten ledgers, there are small annotations, initials, tiny corrections, fleeting human gestures that no royal edict could erase. These are the faint fingerprints of those who labored unseen, whose existence persists only as texture beneath ink. One wonders if they ever imagined that their toil would outlast the monarchs they served. That centuries later, in the quiet hum of an archive, someone would trace their faded handwriting in sense, faintly, the rhythm of their breath. For every empire that rises leaves behind not monuments, but paper. Monuments crumble, but paper waits. And in its waiting, it transforms, from record to relic, from tool to testimony. The final irony of the Royal Paper Office lies in its own disappearance. The building that housed it was demolished to make way for a public square, its ledgers distributed among museums, libraries, and private collections. Yet no complete index remains. No single document lists all others. It is said that this was intentional, that the archivists, knowing the transience of empire, chose to let their work dissolve into fragments. In doing so, they allowed the archive to mimic memory itself, incomplete, suggestive, alive. As the night deepens, the voice of history softens. The courier's footsteps fade into the rhythm of the Tagus. The quills rest. The vats dry. The mills turn to dust. But somewhere, in the dreaming mind of the historian, the process begins anew, the soaking of linen, the pulping, the drying, the cutting, the bundling, the sealing, the dispatching. Again and again, the unseen machine hums beneath consciousness, the eternal bureaucracy of thought. The story of supplying paper to the Portuguese royal court was never merely about the distribution of goods. It was about the architecture of preservation, how a civilization builds its own memory and then entrusts that memory to the most fragile of vessels. It is about the strange faith humanity places in the written word, knowing all the while that ink fades, paper burns, and archives decay. And yet, they continue, the papermakers, the clerks, the archivists, each one feeding the endless loop of remembrance. In the final image, the camera of imagination lingers upon a single page drifting in candlelight. It moves faintly, as though breathing. The words upon it, invisible now, once commanded ships, marriages, deaths, or blessings. But in this moment, it carries nothing but the soft rustle of air. The listener, perhaps half asleep, hears it not as paper but as tide, a low, rhythmic wash, like history exhaling. And in that sound, there is peace. The epilogue closes not with resolution but with surrender, the acceptance that the story, like the paper it describes, is impermanent. The manual has been read, the records have been tallied, the voices have subsided into the sea of sleep. Yet the faint murmur continues beneath consciousness, a hum beneath the waves, a whispering ledger still turning its pages long after the empire has fallen. And so, as the last image fades, the royal court, the mills, the docks, the archives, all dissolve into one slow breath. The paper becomes dust. The dust becomes air. The air becomes silence. And silence, as always, becomes history.